For this lesson, we're going to continue to talk about different procedural concepts of the Supreme Court. Alright, so there's a couple of concepts that we can look at with how the Supreme Court makes their decision, and it's this idea of activism versus restraint. The Supreme Court has the potential to have a massive effect on public policy. Courts can be considered to be activist, or they can be considered to be restrained, depending on the outcome of the case. Judicial activism is a philosophy of judicial review that results in decisions that overturn a precedent. So a precedent is a previous decision that has been made in a case. Alright, and that precedent is largely used thereafter to justify the actions of government or to justify the actions of individuals. Alright, so one of the court cases that we are going to talk about, or there's a couple that we're going to talk about throughout our civil rights and civil liberties, is the idea of Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education. So Plessy versus Ferguson establishes the idea that it is legal to separate people based upon race as long as equal accommodations are provided. So any court case that went along with that afterwards would not have been considered activism. It would have been considered restraint, which we're going to talk about here in a second. All right. But when we have Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education states that it is inherently unequal to separate people based upon race, even if equal accommodations are provided. So that was an activist decision. It overturned the precedent that had been set by Plessy versus Ferguson, and it created a new precedent. So when you create a new precedent and overturn a previous one, that is known as judicial activism. Judicial restraint is when you uphold a precedent. So a court that maintains the status quo or mirrors what the other branches of government have established as current policy, that is known as judicial restraint. Judicial restraint is based upon the idea of stare decisis. Stare decisis is Latin for let the decision stand. The point of view is also supported by those who believe in original intent. This means people who believe in original intent feel that the Constitution should be upheld exactly as the framers wrote it in 1787. Those people could also be referred to as being strict constructionists. So strict constructionists, or people who believe in original intent, believe that every letter of the Constitution should be read and interpreted exactly as the Founding Fathers had intended them to be written in 1787. If you do not believe in this, then you believe in a flexible Constitution, or you are a loose constructionist, and you believe that the Constitution was written in a way and it should be interpreted based upon the current concepts that are happening within the government now. Alright, so when we look at checks and balances, there are limits to the federal courts, just as there are in any of the other branches of the government. Alright, one of the checks on the Supreme Court is the President's ability to appoint Supreme Court justices. When the President has the ability to appoint Supreme Court justices, they can really have an impact on the types of decisions that are made within the Supreme Court. Alright, so if a whole bunch of people die or retire from the Supreme Court, and I'm a Democratic President, I'm going to appoint other Democrats to that position, and that is going to really, have a drastic shift in how those court decisions are made. Alright? And the same thing on the Republican side as well. It's going to make the court, if it was a Republican, it would make the court much more conservative. Congress's power to approve appointments and to impeach and remove justices is another huge check and balance on that branch. These approvals are done through the Senate Judiciary Committee. Alright? Congress also has the ability to set pay rates for justices, which is another check on that branch. Alright, another concept that can check the power of the judicial branch is the idea of substantive due process. This is the legal process that places limits related to the content of legislation and the extent government can use its power to enact unreasonable laws. Substantive due process is generally enforced through the concepts of the 5th and 14th Amendments. So the court has the power to be able to limit what the legislature does by determining whether or not those laws go too far and move beyond the idea of substantive due process. Alright, so let's look at an important court case here. Marbury versus Madison, which takes place in 1803. So in the court case of Marbury versus Madison, Marbury was to be appointed to be Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C. So what happens in this case, and it's important to know the background and the context of what's going on here. Alright, so going into the election of 1800, we have three main candidates. You have John Adams, who's running for re-election, but his presidency is really marred by the XYZ affair. It's marred by the Alien and Sedition Acts. So going into the election of 1800, it's pretty clear that John Adams isn't going to be reelected. The other two main candidates are Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. Now at this time, because this is before the passage of the 12th Amendment, you vote for president twice. Okay, so what ends up happening is Thomas Jefferson makes a deal. And he makes a deal with the electors to have anybody who votes for him as president also vote for Aaron Burr as president as well, because he wanted to avoid John Adams being his vice president. He thought it would be kind of awkward to have a previous president end up being his vice president, and that would cause all sorts of issues. So what ends up happening, though, is that the deal is made so well and people are so loyal to that deal that you end up with this tie between Jefferson and Burr to determine who's going to be president. So this ends up going then to the House of Representatives. So it becomes the House of Representatives' duty to determine who the President of the United States is going to be. Well, we end up going through these rounds and rounds of voting to try and determine, and it's when Alexander Hamilton finally makes a deal later on to break that tie to push Jefferson to the presidency and Aaron Burr to the vice presidency. And this kind of goes along with this historical brouhaha that Hamilton and Burr have with each other. They really have this deep-seated hatred for each other, which ends up later resulting in Aaron Burr shooting and killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel. All right. So after Adams loses this presidency, he starts to make what are known as the midnight court appointments. So in the last few months of his presidency, he tries to fill up the courts with as many Federalist judges as he possibly can. Well, one of the individuals that he appoints with these midnight court appointments is his Secretary of State, who ends up becoming a Supreme Court justice. Well, the Secretary of State is the one who's in charge of delivering all of these appointment letters. And since he's appointed to the Supreme Court and starts to take on that job, he fails to deliver the rest of his letters. Well, one of the individuals who was supposed to get these letters was Marbury. Now, when Jefferson comes into the presidency, he immediately mandates his Secretary of State, James Madison, and tells him to stop delivering the letters. Marbury, who knows he's supposed to be getting this letter, sues and demands that he receive his appointment. Well, the Supreme Court rules in a few different ways. There's a few different things that go on with this. The Supreme Court case originally goes immediately to the Supreme Court without going through the previous earlier courts in the lower court rankings. And they do so because of the Judiciary Act of 1789. So when the Supreme Court hears all these arguments and they go through, there's a few things that they do. They go, 1, the court case should not be here right now because the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. And it expands the power of the Supreme Court too far, so therefore so what that means is we're not going to, any of the testimony that's been heard, we're not going to rule on, and we're going to kick this court case back to the lower court. They said that they did say that James Madison's refusal to deliver the letter was illegal, but they were unwilling to issue a writ of mandamus because the court case shouldn't have been there in the first place. All right, so really the long and the short of it is Marbury doesn't get his position like he wants. The big thing that you should take away from this court case is the idea of judicial review. All right, this court case establishes the idea that the Supreme Court has the right to review a court case and determine whether or not it's constitutional or unconstitutional. The thing that makes the Supreme Court have the ability to participate in judicial review is the idea of a writ of certiorari. A writ of certiorari is a common law writ issued by a superior court to one of inferior jurisdiction demanding the record of a particular case. So, if I'm a Supreme Court justice and I write a writ of certiorari, it is a demand of the lower court to turn over anything that happened, any of the court proceedings, any of the transcripts, any of the other information that they have, to turn that over to the upper court so that they can review what had taken place previously. Right. So let's look at another court case here, McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. The court case of McCulloch v. Maryland takes place because Maryland wanted to impose taxes on all banknotes not chartered in Maryland. And since this is a time before national banks like we're used to, like Chase or Bank of America and things like that, you can't really take that into account when you're looking at this. So this is really looked at as a direct attack on the U.S. national bank that had been established, because it's really the only non-state bank in Maryland at the time. It's the only one that they can really do this with. All right. So what happens is this court case ends up in the Supreme Court in 1819, and the Supreme Court states that it is unlawful for Maryland to try and impose these taxes on this national bank. And this is largely because of the Supremacy Clause. They state that national law supersedes state law, which made that illegal, and that a state cannot tax a legitimate or impede a legitimate action of the national government. They just don't have that right to be able to do that. So therefore, they rule that that law that would have imposed those taxes is unconstitutional because you can't impede the national government from doing something that they legally have the right to do. All right. We also have the court case of Gibbons versus Ogden, which takes place in 1824. In this case, Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton, who is a huge steamboat inventor, had set up an in-state monopoly regarding navigation privileges on the waters of New York. Those who challenged them were bought out or allowed them to purchase franchises so that they could navigate the New York waters for trade. Gibbons and Ogden had worked a route together through a mutual franchise for 3 years until Gibbons violated that partnership by running an independent ship on their mutual route. So when that happened, they decided that they were going to sue each other to try and determine whether or not they had the rights to be able to do these things. Ogden then sued Gibbons for violation of their partnership under state law that states that Gibbons cannot independently run his own shipping company on New York waters. When this case reached the Supreme Court, it was ruled that if there is commerce between the states, which is what was going on, then the federal government had the authority to regulate that trade. And because they had the authority to regulate that trade, monopoly was illegal in this instance, and it allowed the federal government to break up this monopoly. And this once again instates, the big thing you want to take away from this is that Gibbons versus Ogden once again reestablishes that the federal government is superior to state government law, and that they have the right to regulate interstate trade. All right. In 1937, FDR tries to pass what is known as the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill. During the New Deal, a lot of the programs that that Roosevelt had put into place had been ruled as unconstitutional. Now, as a way of trying to fix this, and knowing that his ability to appoint Supreme Court justices would help influence the types of decisions that were made, he petitioned Congress to increase the number of Supreme Court justices from 9 to 13. This would have given him the ability to add 4 more liberal judges to the court, and it would have pretty much ensured that any one of his programs that came before the Supreme Court would have been ruled as constitutional. Now, Congress did not give him the right to be able to add 4 more justices. However, what ended up happening is because these justices now felt threatened, they became much more amiable to making sure that the programs that came before the Supreme Court were given at least a little bit more of a fair shake within the system. All right, some of the notable courts that you should probably know are, we've got the Marshall Court. John Marshall's tenure as Chief of Justice of the Supreme Court was characterized by the landmark decisions of Marbury v. Madison, McCulloch v. Maryland, and Gibbons v. Ogden. All right, these cases shifted the power to the judiciary and the federal government. So the thing that you want to know, especially about the Marshall Court, is that it really gives the federal government a lot more power. All right, we also have the Warren Court. Earl Warren was nominated as Chief Justice by Eisenhower. All right, the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education was argued in his tenure. His court had the reputation of often being liberal and activist, and you can see that through a number of the cases below. Hernandez v. Texas applied the 14th Amendment to Mexican Americans. Baker v. Carr dealt with equitable redistricting, which we talked about before, the idea of one man, one vote. And South Carolina v. Katzenbach required that states to submit changes to their electoral system to the federal government to verify equality in the voting, which is the 15th Amendment. So all of those are very liberal and activist concepts, so that's something that you want to know about the Warren Court. But we then have the Burger Court. Warren Burger was appointed by Richard Nixon as the 15th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Burger Court was more conservative than the Warren Court. Power was handed to the states during his tenure as Chief Justice. So some of his notable cases are Walls versus Tax Commission of the City of New York. In this case, established that the tax exemptions for religious institutions did not violate the Establishment Clause. Lemon versus Kurtzman established a new standard for evaluating funding in religious schools, which we're going to talk about in more depth later on. And Engel v. Vitale, which ruled that the government-written prayers could not be used in schools. So if we look at the vast majority of these cases, they're much more conservative, which is definitely characteristic of the Burger Court. We also have the Rehnquist Court. William Rehnquist was also nominated by Chief Justice by Richard Nixon. Rehnquist was known as a conservative jurist, and the decisions handed down during his tenure reflect judicial restraint and conservative tendencies. So a couple of the notable cases for him are Gonzalez versus Carhart, which upheld a federal ban on partial birth abortions, and Cruzen versus Missouri Department of Health. And this court upheld a decision that disallowed the disconnection of a feeding tube to a patient in a persistent vegetative state unless the patient's preference for termination could be established by clear and convincing evidence. So very, very conservative concepts.